Okay, it's Healthcare Unfiltered, and we do have two first timers, by the way, on this podcast. And but a topic that has been really percolating in my brains for a while until Dr. Braunstein reached out and we chatted about the possibility of doing this, and then we reached out to Dr. Melody, and we're gonna talk about the fellowship applications. Some of these, what we're gonna talk about, may be more relevant to HEMONC, but honestly, in my opinion, I think a lot of the things that will be discussed probably are applicable to any fellow that is applying for any subspecialty, at least in internal medicine. So with that, we'll start with Dr. Megan Melody, just a quick introduction about who you are and where are you doing your fellowship?
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much for having me. So I am a third year Chief Hematology Oncology Fellow at Northwestern. I did my medical school at the University of South Florida, Morsani College of Medicine in Tampa, Florida, and residency at Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville in internal medicine. And now I'm just finishing up my fellowship at Northwestern. And I've accepted a position at the University of South Florida Tampa General Hospital Cancer Institute, where I'll be doing lymphoma and cellular therapy.
It's and the Cancer Center director is a very dear friend and a colleague of mine, Dr. Eduardo Sotomayor. So I should have negotiated your contract with him.
He's
Uh,
a pretty good guy.
he's a great guy. And Dr. Marc Braunstein, a little bit about you and what you do.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. And Megan, it's great to meet you as well. And congratulations on getting a position. So I've been the fellowship program director at the Pearl Meadow Cancer Center in the network at what's now called NYU Grossman Long Island School of Medicine. And I've been in this position for about 4 years now. And so I've had a good amount of experience at this point under my belt of different fellowship years. My clinical focus is in myeloma and lymphoma. And I also do transplant cellular therapy. And I also teach in our medical school, which is a 3-year tuition-free medical school that's geared towards primary care.
That's great. And Marc, I may just ask you to raise your voice just a little bit. I don't know if it's me or I don't know if Megan, you can hear Marc very well, but yeah. So we're gonna drop these doctor stuff and we'll talk about first name basis because it's much easier. So Megan, I wanted to go back a little bit in time to when, when did you decide to apply for HEMONC and how did you even know the process? Like what did you go through to start applying? What do you have to do?
Well, I think perhaps my story is a bit of an anomaly compared to other applicants, but I knew I wanted to do oncology since I was a little kid. My father had Hodgkin's lymphoma and then treatment-related AML, and eventually wound up passing from treatment-related AML. So I've said I wanted to be a hematologist since I was like 6. So when I knew I wanted to apply was probably before I ever even started medical school. However, there are a lot of situations I feel like that I experience that are applicable to any applicant. And I think, as soon as I had a clinical interest in any field, as you said, this can be applicable to any fellowship. Talking to my mentors sort of about, because I was training at an academic institution, talking to my mentors about what they looked for in an applicant and what they felt would strengthen my application, and then sort of focusing my efforts in that area was, I think, really what was when I began to even start preparing for fellowship applications. So even as early as intern year, saying, hey, I think I'm interested and still interested in HEMONC, like talking to my attendings on rotations and saying, what do you look for that's strong in an applicant, aside from, the things that we know you need, like step scores. And I think a lot of people said, clinical acumen was obviously something they really valued. A good attitude and just good letters of recommendation on rounds, but then also obviously, we just are always told this nebulous research bubble. And so I think kind of getting some more granular detail on what that meant and what really defined a good research portfolio for a young trainee was a really helpful part of the mentorship I had during residency.
And Megan, you needed to apply in your second year of residency, correct? Towards the end of second year, mid-second year, when did you need to apply?
I believe applications open like June of second year, so the very last month of residency, if I'm remembering correctly. But that application portal is pretty intense. And so I think you have access to edit it pretty early, like towards the end of your
No,
second year. And
yeah,
so
the end of second year of residency. So you haven't started your
residency.
third year. Okay. So you
Yeah.
needed to
So
come up with a research project during your internship year, which is usually hell of a year. And the second year, which is probably less busy than the second year, but you needed to have like something to talk about to someone like Marc when you interview during those 2 years. One of them is you barely can keep your head up.
yeah.
So Marc, why do we need residents to really do a research project in first and second years? I mean, it seems too much pressure in my view, and I think they could do it in like I know help us understand that.
Well, I think there's a misconception that there's a one formula for applying as a competitive applicant for fellowship, and that research is a key element of that formula. Research is just one component of showing what your overall passion is for pursuing a fellowship specialty. And research particularly shows your dedication, and it shows how you can come up with a original project and work with a mentor and doing the kinds of things that you'll likely be doing during your fellowship years. Since fellowship typically has a lot more time dedicated to protected research time than during your residency. So, it's one thing to do a general research project during your residency, a quality improvement project on diabetes, for example, versus really committing yourself to a project in your fellowship area of interest, in this case, hematology oncology. So it demonstrates your interest, your passion, your commitment to the field. And there's a spectrum, right? There are projects that get abstracts accepted or publications accepted in prestigious hem-onc journals or conferences. And then there are smaller studies that might be an education project or a quality improvement project that may get an abstract at an internal medicine conference, but still had a connection to the field. So it's just another part of the application that shows your commitment to the field.
But let's say that there's a internal medicine resident there that just wants to take care of patients, is a good doc, have no interest in applying for grants, does not want to rewrite papers, but really a good doc, take care of people, understand hematology, oncology, and that's what they want to do. Do they have a chance in getting a fellowship?
Well, there are different types of fellowship programs, right? I mean, there are ones that are very academic and training fellows to become future grant writers, future, bench to bedside researchers. And then there are other programs like our program that is somewhat of a hybrid, where we can train fellows to go in any practice setting. And there are some that are really just focused on community practice and training very good clinicians to go out and just see patients and not be as academic. So I think it really depends on how wide a net you cast in terms of your applications, and if you're applying to the right programs that are going to train you to become the type of oncologist you wish to be 3 years after fellowship.
That's a good point. So, Megan, how easy was to find that research project for you? And did you find one that at least, like some talking points when you are applying for a fellowship in the second year of your residency?
Yeah, so I actually just wanted to address what Marc was answering as well. I completely agree with what he said about, finding a fellowship that kind of fits your needs. I think I don't want to speak for Northwestern in and of itself, but obviously they train some amazing community oncology physicians, but obviously they're a very big academic center. And so they are recruiting fellows that want to pursue academic medicine, but I know plenty of my colleagues that went to centers that still have the opportunity to train you in academics. I don't think any fellowship is going to say they don't want you to look at academics at all, but really primarily focus on creating a more broad-based curriculum. So fellows not subspecializing in their third year and, providing training for a general oncologist. And those programs, I think, would emphasize research a lot less in the fellowship application process. But I think, to go to a place like Northwestern, like, one of the larger academic centers and not have a lot of research experience, I think it would be tough to get your feet on the ground, because I think the expectation is that you engage in academic medicine at those centers during fellowship.
And I get that. I guess I get that. I think the statistics do not support that theory. because
Okay.
if I take, well, I mean, I don't have the hard numbers. I probably should have looked at these numbers. But if I look at all Hem/Onc fellows, if I look at the number of programs that we have, the majority of programs are usually academic. I mean, I get the idea that there are some community-based programs, but I think, right, Marc? I mean, you're more entrenched in that world. I believe most programs are academic, and then if I look at the number of fellows across the country, I look at the percent that stay in academia versus community. Do we have that breakdown? Just trying to think through the numbers.
Well, numbers-wise, about 85% of people who applied for the current cycle matched. So the odds are very much in the applicant's favor, whether or not they did research. But you're right that the majority of programs have an academic program because they're ACHEME accredited. They have a academic infrastructure for the training program. So most programs are likely looking for applicants who have at least some skills in doing research. And that's also going to support the faculty who are mentoring them during their tenure as fellows. So the faculty want fellows to help them with their research and be involved in the process too. So, again, it is important, but it's just one component of the application. And, there are going to be some applicants, like myself, who are MD PhDs and have a lot of research years under their belt. And some, like you were saying in the beginning, who really don't have a lot of time during their residency to do a substantial research project. So, you want to have your letters, you want to have your, a good personal statement, a good interview, and you at least want to have committed to something that shows you went a step above to do some kind of research project. The stronger that is, the stronger your application will be.
So we talked about research, Megan. Marc alluded to the personal statement. Obviously, you have a wonderful story, albeit sad, to what got you this. And I think a lot of people have similar stories, I believe. And is that what you wrote in your personal statement? Like, how did you decide to write in your personal statement?
I did use it for my personal statement for medical school. I think there's no doubt about it. I think I would be lying if I didn't say that was my motivation to go to medical school. So I'm glad I used that as part of my personal statement for medical school, and even alluded to it a bit in my personal statement for residency. Of course, it's what sparked my interest for hematology and oncology. But at that point, I was advanced enough in my profession or my professional development that there were other motivating factors aside from having a parent who was sick when I was a child. And I wanted to make sure I emphasized that maturation of that thought process. And so during my personal statement for fellowship, I actually did not mention it. It's come up throughout my training with my mentors later on who had no idea. And I think that's been as I've developed research projects during fellowship, one of them is actually looking at treatment-related toxicities associated treatment for Hodgkin's lymphoma and preventing secondary malignancies. So it's been a really, personal passion. But no, I did not use it for my personal statement. What I used for my personal statement was actually the research project I developed in residency and how it really truly fueled my interest for CAR T-cell therapy. And I thought that showed my development as a clinician a lot more than an experience I had at the age of 6.
I mean, it's fascinating that you talked about CAR T therapy as a resident, right? I mean,
yeah.
There are many fellows who are barely grasping as to how all of these things work. So kudos to you. But Marc, I think, so you're the fellowship program director. You're getting all of these applications. We'll go over the numbers, how many numbers you get. But personal statements, do you read all of them verbatim? How important are they? How can you tell if somebody's just making stuff up, right? I mean, making stuff up, or do you need to even know? Because people want to just try to give you the emotional story. Tell us what you look for in a personal statement.
Great question. And Megan, thank you for sharing your personal story here. One of the privileges of what I get to do every year is to read these personal stories. And it's really common for applicants to put their personal experience with a family member or a friend, or even a very touching clinical experience they had as a medical student into their personal statement. And we see that all the time because I think that it's that spark, it's that passion that's going to sustain you throughout your career, why you entered the field. Now, the personal statement is one area where you really have full control over what you're going to say. You can't change your board scores, you can't change your research project by that time, but you can control what you're going to say, and it has to tell the story of how you got from, you know, applying to medical school to now applying for fellowship, and what really drives you to this field. What was the trajectory? I guess you can't tell if somebody made up a personal vignette, but you can tell based on the different paragraphs of that statement of whether there really was a connection, that you can draw a line from where they started and what path they're on to get to where they want to be. And if you read enough of these, you start to be able to distinguish which ones are genuine and which ones are kind of wishy-washy and not really clear. Do we read all of them? Not all of them, but we try to screen every application. And the ones that we kind of distill further, we read all of those applications in detail, because again, that's their really personal touch and personal story of why they're applying. And you can tell a lot about the applicant from that story.
I feel there's like the hook in the personal statement. Like it's almost like, you know, when you write a book or like even a paper, I kind of feel that like they need to get your attention in the first paragraph, or you probably won't read it. Am I onto something?
Well, I guess there are some things you don't want to say in that personal statement. You know, from the day I was born, oncology was for me. You know, I've always had a passion for this. You know, you want a hook that engages the reader, that makes you stand out, but in a very engaging way. So that, as a result, very often it starts with a personal example. You know, I was working in the ward and this happened, or from a very young age, I remember my, you know, family member going through their chemotherapy. So it often starts out with that hook, because you're reading so many of these applications, you want to kind of get invested in this person and know what their story was, their personal story. That first paragraph really draws you in and gets you to see how you know, passionate they are about this, sometimes from a very young age.
From a scale of 0 to 10, how important, Mark, is the personal statement?
So I'd say once the person is in the door and getting the interview, I'd say it's probably about a 7. Before that, I'd say it's probably a 4 or 5.
That's helpful. So Megan, back to you. So the research project is undergoing and you time managed, you're able to do something to talk about your personal statement. You are working on this. What else are you doing to prepare to apply? We haven't applied yet, but what else are you preparing? Recommendation
Well,
letters?
I think, yeah, so the recommendation letters, and then weirdly, as unusual as it sounds, just like we were trained in high school and in college, like extracurriculars matter too. So like definitely being a well-rounded person, I think was
You mean you're
helpful.
going to
People
do
ask,
research in internship and second year and you still want to have a life?
yeah, well, a life, and then also you have to show commitment to like the institution you're training at. So I was very involved with like the Mayo Fellows Association. I was the president of that, and so like really showed commitment to the institution and why I loved Mayo Clinic and training there. And then I got asked a lot about like what I read in my spare time and interviews and like what I like to do in my spare time. So surprisingly, I had to be like a very well-rounded human being. I think because they didn't want like just a like research robot that was not a human being at all.
But like, how is that like well, it's either you are or you're not, right? I mean, right? I mean, everybody has a different personality. There are people who are extroverts, people who are introverts. There are, you know, different personalities. And I think I want to have Mark react to this. But how, like, what were you doing certain things? Like, did you say, I'm going to read just because I'm applying for fellowship? You were just a reader. You just like to read. Right? I mean,
Yeah,
like
so I'm
that.
shaking my head. No, I did not just read books for
Yeah,
fellowship,
that's
but
my
I
point.
think
Yeah.
part of the fellowship, the application, so there's a research section. I mean, assuming it's the same as when I applied 3 years ago, right? There's a research section, then there's like a professional experience section, and then there's like an other section, like other scholarly work section. And so, you know, for those sections, I wanted to demonstrate my commitment not just to hematology and oncology, but also to, like I said, the institution I trained at. So mentioning the organizations I was involved in there, quality improvement projects that I worked on, which is often part of a graduation requirement for residency. And then, so just kind of highlighting those experiences, a lot of which are already required by your residency. And then, no, there's just a portion of your application that asks, like, what do you like to do in your free
Right.
time? And so obviously I highlighted that.
I think recommendation letters are expected. I will ask Mark
Yes.
about this, but in deciding who will write your recommendation letters for you, how did you
Mhm.
decide the specialty? I presume not all of them are oncologists, but how did you decide who are the folks that you are going to ask, and how long did it take? Because I have a couple of questions about this to Mark that I think he's probably going to enjoy answering.
Okay, well, yeah, I'd be interested to know if Mark thought I did it right. I don't know. So I had we obviously do internal medicine rounds or rotations multiple times throughout first, second, and third year. And so I was fortunate enough to have some attendings that I worked with both as an intern, sometimes a second and a third year, or sometimes just an intern and a third year. And so I thought that they could really speak to, my attitude as an intern is really the thing that matters, your attitude and work ethic, and then my growth and clinical expertise as I became a third year. And so, starting towards the end of my second year, beginning of my third year, only a few months before applications I think were due, I asked people if they felt comfortable writing me a letter. Most of my letters came from internal medicine. And then I had one primary mentor who I'd worked with a couple times on like a rotation in HEMONC that then became my research mentor. And so they couldn't speak so much to my clinical skills. And I think, as we've kind of touched upon, research is a component, but I think being a doctor and being clinically capable of practicing medicine is important too. So I actually only had one letter from a hematology oncology uh, professor, and the rest were from internal medicine.
Some physicians are so busy that they occasionally tell you, write the letter, I will edit it and delete, like, at least you have a skeleton thing, like write what you want me to write, and then I'll go ahead and edit and change, and it will still come from the physician who wrote the letter, but at least basically you're helping them because they're just so busy. Is this something that you are asked to do?
It has been something I've been asked to do in the past for other applications, but I will tell you that when someone's asked me to do that, I've been a little bit hesitant to use their letter, just because, what I say about myself is not going to be as emphatically or enthusiastically
Yeah,
bragging or
of
as I would
course.
hope that someone would be about my application. And so, I have done that. But I've also then been hesitant to use those letters. Sometimes I've asked someone else as well.
So, Mark, to you, recommendation letters, everybody will have somebody that can say some nice things about them, like everyone. If you have like no one that says something nice about you, then it's a problem. So, it's almost you ask for 3 recommendation letters and people are going to write them. And it's very unlikely that the fellow applicant is going to ask someone to write them a letter unless they know they're going to be complimentary, right? I mean, let's face it. If I did not get along with Dr. Smith, I'm not going to go and, hey, write me a letter. So with that in mind, I recognize you're going to get 3 or 4 letters, but they're all going to be saying that, Megan is great.
Well, I hope they would. It would be foolish to ask someone you didn't get along with or someone who didn't
Right.
hold you in high regard for a letter. In fact, that would be a red flag. So there is an art to asking for a letter, and now being on the other side in leadership, there's an art to writing a letter, and it's very difficult to write a letter of recommendation for anyone you've worked with that doesn't sound repetitive or just trite and ordinary. So a lot goes into this actually for faculty development throughout ASCO, program director meetings about how to actually write a good letter. Now, let's start with the art of asking for the letter. When you ask for clinicians for letters, they are very busy, and they may not even remember all the things that are vivid in your mind as the applicant that worked well when you work with that faculty member. So you want to ask them, obviously, can you write me a strong letter? You want to give them something tangible that they can use, your CV, for example, or even some highlights of things that were meaningful to you during that rotation that they can put into the letter. And you may even want to sit down with them and not just ask for the letter, but also talk about what your career goals are and what types of programs you're applying for. As the letter writer, just to take a step back, actually, when someone tells you to write their letter for yourself and then give it to them, often what happens is that applicants write letters that are not strong enough. They feel like they don't want to be too gratuitous, and they end up writing weaker letters, actually. So as a letter writer, like I was saying, it is difficult to write a letter that's unique and just not, very ordinary. So what I try to do is I try to sit down with the applicant and say, what are your career goals? What are some highlights of your CV that I can include? What have you done to demonstrate your interest in the field? And I try to break it down into paragraphs. So the first one being, what is my role in the institution? How did I meet this individual? And then what did they do that really impressed me? They worked on this research project, and I'm not just going to quote their CV, but something that we actually discussed that was meaningful about that experience. They published it, they gave a talk, etc. And, the last parts of that letter are, would I feel lucky if this person matched in my program? Would I feel comfortable if they were taking care of my family members or my patients? And, I try to put those personal touches. I haven't really ever written a letter that was sensational, like, stop right here, look at this letter, look at this applicant, because I don't want to do something that might jeopardize or maybe rub someone the wrong way. But I've written letters that are very personable and are detailed. In the medical school, I've also sat on the medical school admissions committee, and we once heard of a letter where they asked somebody from a pizza restaurant where they worked at to write a letter. And it was so good because it described how hard they had worked in that restaurant, how much they dedicated themselves, how much they had to learn in that industry, that it was memorable. And so you want letter writers to write letters that are really about you and are distinguishing you versus any other applicant.
Marc, as the recipient of these letters, can you recall some letters where well, I'll take that back. You receive these letters, the oncology community is pretty small, despite how big it is. I mean, you could pick up the phone and say, hey, I just got this letter about this resident. Is this for real? Like, is she that good? Is he that good? Like, because the letter is the letter, but you can always pick up the phone and talk to somebody. I guess how often you do that? How often do you just send an email, say, do you have 5-10 minutes to chat about this applicant? Are there letters that stick in your mind that were just so bad and you were shocked about them, and letters were just like way too good to be true? You also like red flags. You mentioned all this, but can you just help us a little bit as to how you evaluate these letters?
Absolutely. So put yourself in the mind frame of someone who's screening 300 applications, right? Pretty quickly, you learn to distinguish a pretty decent letter from a bad letter. A bad letter, maybe only one paragraph, said, I work with this patient, this applicant, they were great, you should really accept them. And there's no detail in that letter. There's no paragraphs discussing what was meaningful about that experience with them. We can make phone calls, and we often do that once we whittle down the list and we're making the rank list to about 24 applicants to match 3. We will sometimes make phone calls based on their letters, maybe to the program director or maybe to someone in the field that we know. But I think what distinguishes a really good letter from a poor one is how much detail was put into that letter. If you can erase the name of the applicant and put anybody's name on that letter, there's nothing personal about it. It's not a good letter. It doesn't really show that you had any meaningful connection to the applicant. So that's why I'm saying when you ask for the letter, you want to be prepared to give the letter writer information and maybe even sit down with them and talk about your career goals and how that letter is going to make you stand out.
I love that. I love, actually, Megan, I love that example. If you can erase the name and you could put that is actually a very, very good. Well, but last question before I move to the next thing. What would lead you to call the letter writer? Like, is there certain things that will let you know, I'm going to send an email and just talk to this guy?
If we know them, if they're from a neighboring institution,
Okay,
or if they're from our own institution, or if we're kind of on the fence about where exactly to rank them, we might make that call.
got it. So now, Megan, you have the letters of recommendation, you have your research project, you're well-rounded. We talked about the personal statement. Now it's time to apply. I think HEMONC is becoming increasingly competitive. So, some people maybe have the luxury of, I just can apply only to 5 programs and I'm confident I'll get in. How many programs did you apply for, if you can share with us? But how many programs do you think fellows are applying for right now? Do they just send like to 50 programs and see what happens? Like what happens from a fellow's perspective in that department?
I actually am pulling it up right now because I have somewhere saved on my computer how many programs I applied to because I no longer remember. I think I applied to 21 programs, I think is how many I applied to. I think
Back in my
somewhere
day,
around
I
there.
applied to every Midwest institution, and I think I applied also to MD Anderson. They wrote me the nicest letter that I'm like, so good, but so good that they're not gonna give me. No, but so that's 20. Mark, I mean, is this what you're seeing for fellows?
It's interesting, you know, since the pandemic, all the interviews have been virtual, and as far as I know, it's going to continue that way. So there are less barriers to applicants applying broadly because they don't have to travel and take as much time away from their life to interview. You know, it's always sad when you see someone who didn't match because they didn't cast a wide enough net in terms of their applications, or they really thought they were a shoo-in in one place and only applied to a handful of places. So, you know, you want to apply to a broad, you know, array of programs that are maybe top tier and maybe middle of the road for you, and so that you'll have a better chance of matching the more programs you apply to.
So now you have, how many applications do you get a year? 300, you
We
said?
get about 350 a year for 3 slots.
For 3 slots. So obviously you're not going to invite everybody. How do you, I mean, you also want to match, right? You don't want to, I mean, it's like this whole thing, like I don't want to send enough interviews because the match process, I think, helps applicants, right? Megan, do you agree it helps applicants more than the programs? Because you really put your top program, all they can do is not rank you.
I mean, I don't really know. I always feel like the match is kind of this nebulous process, but supposedly it ranks or is more preferable for the applicant than the program. That's what I've been told.
So as a program director, how do you decide how many interviews you extend to the degree that you hopefully can match, but still not send to like 100 applicants?
That is difficult. I mean, for programs that have more spots, some have six slots, some have 18. They're going to need to obviously interview a lot more applicants, and so we being a somewhat smaller program with smaller cohort of faculty, we don't interview more than about 24 applicants because one, we just don't have the bandwidth. We don't have the time. Our faculty doesn't have the time to commit to interviewing so many days. And we are generally comfortable with that number of applicants interviewed to facilitate an almost guaranteed match.
So eight applicants per position, technically.
That's right. That's right. So it's really challenging to will that list from 350 to 24 applicants to interview. It's very challenging.
Do you have other faculty or assistants or people do you give them criteria as the program director and say, I'm not going to read 350 applications, weed out based on this exclusion criteria? Do you do that?
We don't do that in our program. My associate program director and I go through actually all 350, kind of painstakingly go through their application. The ERAS program can distill the list for you into an Excel file with all the board scores. So if you wanted to filter it based on certain things, number of publications, board scores, medical school, whether they're international or domestic graduate, things like that, you can actually filter that list, or even by geography. But we try to go through all 350 and look for ones that have a similar interest in the culture of our program. And then from there, we ask our other faculty members to kind of help and weigh in on who they think would be a good fit. But inevitably, we probably don't interview some candidates that would be a good fit for our program. It's just we can't interview all 350.
And Megan, from your standpoint, this is not a cheap process. I mean, technically, you have to fly to a lot of places or drive. You have to likely stay one night in a hotel. So if you go to 20 interviews, honestly, you could be $15,000 to $20,000 sometimes if you just budget $1,000 per interview, maybe a little bit less. So in a sense, were you planning on visiting all 20? should you have given an interview? How many interviews did you get? Did you get some interviews you declined and said, you know what, I have enough. This like was probably a lower tier program. I just as a safety net, and I probably don't need to. Like, tell us what was going through your mind after you applied and what happened.
Yeah, so a couple things there. So the first is so obviously I encountered a lot of that during my residency interview, but during residency is when the pandemic happened. And so for fellowship, all interviews are now virtual. So we're not incurring that cost of travel.
Oh, still,
So
I'm
they're
sorry to
all,
interrupt. Still right now, they're all virtual?
and they're gonna probably remain that way, is my understanding. Yeah,
So that goes against, like Mark, I think like it's hard to know the culture of the program and in the interactions unless you're there
exactly.
in person, no?
Exactly.
It,
Yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say. It's a hurdle for sure.
on both sides, it's hard for the applicant too to get a sense of the program without being there. It is possible to offer them an ability to come and take a look at your actual campus, but all the interviews are virtual now.
So even after the like, oh, I did not know that. That's actually interesting. And is that a decision by the ACGME, decision that the institutions made collectively, or?
It's endorsed by the all the professional societies and ACGME. It's just, you know, all the interviews are going to be either virtual or not. It's not that one program can decide. So we
I
just
see.
made a coordinated decision.
Do you like that, Megan? What are your thoughts?
There are definitely pros. I really appreciated during residency, a lot of residency programs don't give designated time off for fellowship interviews. It's kind of like an informal thing where you have to arrange your schedule so you're not on internal medicine rotations or ICU rotations during the fellowship season. And so it was extremely helpful that if I had an interview for a program I loved and happened to just be on ICU, that I could step away for a few hours and tell my fellow or
Uh,
my attending and go to that interview. Most of them were only about a half day. So it made it a lot more accessible, but you're again only getting a half day of
yeah.
exposure to the faculty. I matched to Chicago. Northwestern is an amazing program. I could not say how much I love this program more, but I had never been to Chicago. I had never seen Northwestern. I didn't know anyone on faculty. And so it was kind of, a gut feeling from talking to faculty for 6 hours that this is where I wanted to be. And I'm really happy I made that choice. But I think a lot of people who, were moving maybe without a partner or things like that would be less comfortable taking that jump, having that little exposure to an
Sure.
institution.
Mark, as you arrange for the interview schedule per candidate, how do you decide which faculty you need to interview? How do you assemble, I guess, the interview schedule? And do you have them also meet with existing fellows in your program?
Yes. So we try to invite faculty, well, first and foremost, who are available, but who have diverse interests. So we have the director of our clinical trials office. We have our division chair, and we try to diversify it by both specialty interests, by gender, by background. Like one of our former fellows who's now faculty is an interviewer. And then while one group is interviewing, the other group meets virtually with a cohort of our fellows. And we don't monitor that. And we tell them, you can ask them whatever you want. We're not going to ask our fellows what you asked them or who you were. So that's an open forum where they can really get, genuine feedback from our fellows without restrictions.
Okay. Now, Megan, how was your interview process? I know it was virtual and everything, but what kind of questions were you asked? Were there certain interviews where you were asked kind of questions you weren't expecting and made you pause? Anything you can share with our listeners or viewers, what to expect in an interview if you're an applicant?
Depended on the institution. A lot of the institutions were informal questions, sort of get to know you questions, and what I was interested in, both research wise, clinically wise, like I said, the books I like to read or what I like to do in my spare time. And then there were some institutions where the majority of the questions were behavioral interview questions, or at least the interviewers were required to ask one behavioral interview question. Mark, I'm not sure if that's something your
What is
institution
that?
does.
What does
It's
that
like,
mean?
can you tell me a time when you didn't work well with a member of your team and how you handled that? Or can you tell me a time where you saw a medical error and how did you handle that? And I know that like a lot of places are required to ask those questions, but for me, it felt very impersonal and very formulaic. And so I actually tended to not feel as warm and fuzzy about those institutions as the ones that truly ask personalized questions based on my CV and my personal statement. So that's kind of my experience with the questions that were asked.
Mark, how any comment on these behavioral type of questions?
Well, those can be sometimes awkward and put you on the spot, and maybe that's a program that does interest you if that's their culture. But I think it's reasonable to ask, maybe tell me about a patient you saw that had an oncologic issue that was meaningful to you. All the faculty are going to be interviewing the same candidates and asking the same questions, and we can't all ask, well, why do you want to be an oncologist? So some faculty members want to toss things up a little bit and ask a little bit more stressful questions. But as long as you maybe have one vignette prepared in your arsenal of interview responses, I think that should be fine. And you're interviewing the program too. So if you felt uncomfortable during an interview, maybe that says something about the program too.
I mean, some of these questions are pretty odd. So I'll just share a personal. I'll share a personal story. My kids are applying for college in the next like year and a half or something. So I did a couple of college tours. So one of the places I went to, Megan, is University of Chicago, which I mean, I was faculty. I'll just go and visit with them. So the guy who was giving us like the tour and everything, he said, well, I mean, there are like regular applications, but we also have our own type of questions at University of Chicago because we feel like we really need to know you a little bit more. So one of the questions that you could be asked is, if you are an animal, what kind of animal you are and why? And both of my boys look at me, I have twins, and like, how do we even answer that? I mean, is this even helpful? Like, really? I mean, I presume this falls into behavioral type of questions or an insight type of question that people are asking, not medical errors per se, but they want to know how you're thinking. Is this helpful?
So, I think the goal is to see how you think on your feet or your paws, depending on which kind of animal you are. I think the goal is to see how you think on your feet. So for the medical school, we have this mini medical interviews where you go through a series of like 8 different scenarios and how you would think. So it gets you to think outside the box, but I hope they're also asking you, why do you want to enter the field, and these, classic questions as well.
Yeah. Okay. So you got the interviews. Some of them are pleasant, some of them not. Now you have to go to your rank, Megan. How do you decide how you get, like, did something stood out of some program that said, these are my top, like, I would love to, and what made you decide your top few institutions as you rank? And the same question I'm going to ask to Mark is how you decide on ranking the applicants.
Well, I definitely was. I mean, I'm a little type A. I was a spreadsheet kind of girl, and I know everyone tells you not to do that. The thing is, I made a spreadsheet of the things I thought were valuable in a fellowship program. And at the end of the day, they all come out to around the same thing. They're all governed by the same ACGME rules. Like one may have 3 weeks of vacation, one may have 4, but the third one that has 3 weeks may offer you an extra week of research travel or conference travel that's paid for. And so I think at the end of the day, when I really was looking at that, it came down to location, faculty mentorship, the feel of the program, the one thing I will say that varies a lot between the programs, and I on our open houses for interview day, I always make sure to mention this to the prospective fellows, is to make sure you understand what the program defines as a call day, because each program defined it very differently, which we can talk about if you want. But I always emphasize that to make sure that you know what their call schedule is like and things. But it was more of the intangibles that wound up eventually being the things that kind of helped me make my rank list, and obviously location. And for me, I'm married, so my partner preference as well. But I think that the spreadsheet wound up not being as helpful as it was for residency, because fellowships overall are fairly similar in terms of the
well, it's you're
concrete
brave.
variables.
You're brave coming from Florida. You're ending up in Chicago. That's
I'm going back to Florida. I mean, it's
I know.
cold
I was
here.
gonna say, yeah. So, Mark, as you decide on your rank list, how do you decide on that?
Sure, I'll give you sort of behind the scenes of how we do it. But I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that it's just me with the rubber stamp making, different rank lists by myself, and I have the final say. I don't. We meet as a committee of all of the faculty who did the interviews. During the actual interview, when the day is over, we have a handout that we give to the faculty for them to fill out different components, their research, their interaction during the interview. And then at the end, there's a part that says, should they be ranked in the top, 5? Should it be somewhere in the middle, or should they not be ranked at all? And very rarely that not ranked at all box is checked. We put all those together. We make a numerical total of all those different elements of the interview and the application. And then we meet as a committee for about 2 or 3 hours to create that final rank list based on everything. And often it's the ones in the middle where we're really having a debate about which one should be ranked a little bit higher, or which one is more likely to want to come to our program, and things like that. So it's a committee decision based on the application and based on the interview.
So, but let me ask you this. I heard that a lot from program directors, the last comment you mentioned, which is, what is the likelihood of this person coming into the program? Why does this matter? I mean, it's a match issue. Like, it doesn't really matter. I mean, even if the person is unlikely, like, look, let's say they want to put a different program, but they still will rank you. Maybe you're number 4, not number 1. It doesn't matter because it's about match, no?
You're right. And to some extent, once you get past the top 5 or so, it's kind of splitting hairs at that point. And it doesn't matter because no matter what order you put the applicants in, it's their order that matters too, whether they ranked you higher than another program. So it's sort of just splitting hairs about those applicants in the middle, because we rarely go below our 10th, rank. So it's just more about, how can we figure out who should be ranked a little bit higher, or maybe we're more likely to capture them. But you're right. It to some extent, it's a little bit arbitrary because it matters whether they like our program or not once you get that far down on the list.
And I do hear this, Megan, like some programs say, like, if they really are not going to rank me as a program top 3, I don't want somebody who put me on whatever, like lower, because it means that they just were forced to come in. I'm not really sure. I mean, I don't know whether Northwestern was your number 1 or not. But, I mean, I presume you would have been happy if you got to number 5 or 6. No? I mean, did you not rank? Were there programs you interviewed at that you did not rank at all?
Yes, there were. But no, I only ranked programs I would have been happy to go to. But you have to think about it from an applicant's point of view. When I ranked someplace, I had to say, would I rather go to this program than not be a hematologist, oncologist at all? That's
Exactly.
the question you ask yourself.
Exactly.
And so it's a pretty low bar to say I'm like not going to rank this program at all, right? Like I would really have to hate the program. And so I think there was only 1 or 2 where I was just like, this is not in line with my goals. I would rather wait a year and reapply. And that's because, like I said, I've always had an interest in research, and I've had an interest in CAR T-cell therapy from the beginning of my career. And so going to a place where they don't do CAR T-cell therapy was not an option for me. And so knowing that, when I interviewed places that didn't do that, I took them off my list, and I would rather have waited a year. And that was important for me to know. But yes, I would have been happy being an oncologist anywhere. I think that I ranked. But I think going down on your rank list, I think kind of what Marc was alluding to as well is, it's an up 6 thing, right? Like you don't want to have to go down to your 12th choice, I think, both for candidates and for applicants. And so it's nice when you get your top choice. I actually was wondering, Marc, do you ever have your applicants like write letters that say that they're going to rank you highly? I think we had this conversation amongst our fellowship program directors recently that like whether or not it's frowned upon or whether that's well received when an applicant writes a letter that says, hey, I really like my interview, I'm going to rank you fairly highly.
It's a great question. I mean, there are rules, right? You're not supposed to say that you are going to rank someone number 1, and they're not supposed to say that either. But if you truly have a couple of programs that you're really intent on ranking highly, I think it's perfectly reasonable to reach out and say, look, I really had a good experience getting to know your faculty and your program, and I'm really highly interested. And it goes both ways. We may really want to get a candidate and say, look, all the faculty really enjoyed meeting you. I hope you'll really think of us highly. But you don't want to do it for all the programs, obviously.
Yeah.
Okay. That's helpful. A couple of questions I have. Mark, so you've extended an interview to someone who's, and what type of questions do you ask in this interview now before the match? Because what I would like to suggest, let's say you're interviewing the person and one of the questions you ask is, what are you going to do with your life when you're done? Is this I mean, it's a cliche question, I think. And I think most of us sometimes we don't know. I mean, I swear to God, I had no idea I'm going to be where I am right now back then. But my question to you is, how important the answer to this question is to you? Number two is, what if somebody tells you, I want to be a community oncologist after I finish from NYU? Is this off your list now? You're never going to rank him again?
So my number one goal above everything I do as the fellowship program director is to get fellows to where they want to go after they're done with their fellowship. And that can be in any field, in any setting. I mean, I think it's reasonable to ask candidates, what are your career goals? What's your subspecialty area of interest? And that might change throughout their fellowship training. They may be interested in GI malignancies and then may change that to hematologic malignancies. But I think it's reasonable to at least get a sense of what their interests are. And it also shows how knowledgeable they are about the nature of the field. But really, the goal of fellowship training is to get you to the next step 3 years later. You're not going to be in fellowship forever. So I think it's reasonable to say, where do you see yourself going? And if they say they're not interested in academics, that's fine, but they should be prepared to at least commit to some academic work while they're in their fellowship training.
So you could still rank this individual.
Absolutely. It's not just about getting everybody to stay in academia. It's getting people to graduate from fellowship, being ready to commit to the field and make some impact, whether that's in the community to patients who really need to see a good clinician, or to make headway in a new development for quality improvement or for a new therapeutic intervention. It's not just about becoming a grant-funded clinician researcher.
And my last thing is, we'll have just an open thing, whatever I did not ask you, but my last question that I'm always struggling with is, oncology is moving fast. Hematology is moving fast. There's a lot of new things happening. I mean, when I was a fellow or a resident, there was no such a thing as CAR-T or bispecifics or none of that stuff. As a program director, how are you trying to develop or evolve your curriculum to really match the fast pace of hematology and oncology? Because honestly, it is very fast paced right now. I mean, without the stats, we all know that every 1 to 2 weeks almost, there's a new drug that's approved by the FDA, either in heme or in solid tumors. And usually there's a companion diagnostic, there's a molecular test. I mean, there's so much. And your job, as you said, you want to make sure you develop the curriculum for teaching. I don't envy you for this job. So how do you do it?
Yeah, I'll give my answer, and then I'm interested to hear Megan's experience. I've always said it's a great time to be in oncology. It's a very difficult time to learn oncology because there is so much to learn. And modern learners too learn in dynamic ways and don't just want to sit in a lecture room and being talked to by a faculty who's expert in that area and just sit there and not be engaged. So you have to create a dynamic curriculum that is going to adjust to different types of learners. So we have our initial summer boot camp where you learn about the basics, chemotherapy and managing emergencies, and then our year-long curriculum that repeats every year. Then you have journal clubs, you have journal reviews where the fellows will present the newest 5 papers in different hem-onc articles that were published in the past month. They have a board review class. We have tumor boards. There's a molecular tumor board, and then there are their clinical rotations. So a sum of all of that should capture all the things you need to know. And then, of course, going to conferences and keeping up to date. So we facilitate a budget that allows them to travel to conferences, that has funding for research and things like that, that will keep them really engaged and keep them up to date. All our fellows take the in-training exam, and that allows them, it's non-putative, it's just meant to be, allow them to gauge where their knowledge is at. And we meet with them and we review their outcomes. So that allows them to gauge their learning as well. So there are multiple mechanisms to keep them engaged and learn in different ways.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that Marc said. I think my program tries to facilitate a dynamic curriculum as well. For my own personal education, I kind of view my training in 2 buckets. The first is preparing for boards. Unfortunately, it has to exist in two buckets. The first is preparing for boards. So for that, I'm very fortunate. Our program, and I'm sure Marc's does as well, offers us the opportunity to use the MD Anderson Board Review Series, the ASCO question bank, the ASH question bank,
And
and the
Megan, I
ASH
hope
Hematologic Review
you're
Series.
following the maintenance of certification, recertification, ABIM debacle that I'm really covering very heavily, but go ahead.
I have been following it on Twitter and podcasts. That was also what I was going to say. The other thing that I've been utilizing a lot is the podcast. So your podcast, the Neil Love podcast, the two OncDoc podcasts, I think are really important in highlighting high yield information, and the Fellows on Call podcast. So I'm listening to those constantly. But then, that's not actually the unfortunate part about, or the unfortunate truth currently in our specialty is that that's not really helpful for my career development. So the role I'm taking on, I will not round on solid onc patients. I will not see benign hematology patients. And so I have to kind of take my own initiative and my own career development outside of board review to ensure that I'm staying up to date on the latest cellular therapies, lymphoma treatments. And so I do think that that's a struggle that is kind of, a thing that our field and our training will need to address as this continues to evolve. But, there's new drugs that just came out for GI cancers that I want to know so I can pass my boards, but really has no bearing on my professional development.
Speaking of podcasts, since you both are in heme, I do actually have, this is a plug for my other podcast called the Hemonc Pulse, and it's only heme, by the way, only heme.
I do have that on my library
so
subscription as well. Don't worry.
Yeah, it's only heme. I guess my last thing is, what did I not ask you that you think is really important? I mean, the goal of this is really to make sure that listeners and viewers really understand the process from a fellow's perspective, program director perspective. I think it's so important, but I don't know if I covered everything. So Megan, maybe I'll start with you. Is there anything that you want to tell viewers and listeners?
Yeah, there are two things I always tell the fellows when they're coming to, we do an open house for fellows to potential applicants after they've done the interview. And there are two things I tell all of the potential fellows that they should be asking programs. The first is what their call schedule is like, because people say often like, oh, we only take call, once a month. And the difference is like what a program considers call. So at my institution, we have something called division call, where the fellows hold the pager for the entire faculty. And we do that for 1 to 2 days a month. So technically we're on call 1 to 2 days a month. However, when we're on our inpatient rotations, we actually hold the pager, the fellow pager, 24/7 for the entire month that we're on that service, except for our 4 days off. And so that's a different thing than the residency program where I trained, where you just hold the pager for all the services at night, as well as all the attendings for a week at a time for every 6 weeks. And so, that's kind of what I was saying when I said you make your spreadsheet and it kind of all comes out in the wash. But if one of those seems intolerable for you, saying that we only take call 1 day a week you're not comparing apples to apples. You're not saying, oh, this place I take 6 days of call in a straight and this one I take 1 per month. There's still a commitment to the pager. And I think knowing that and knowing what'll work for your lifestyle is really important. For me, I found that during my first year of fellowship, it was really exhausting to be on the pager 24/7 when I was on an inpatient rotation. That being said, the other important question I think it's important for fellows to ask is what the curriculum looks like as you advance through the years. So we don't have designated research months at Northwestern. I put that in quotes because I realized I'm on a podcast and just did that with my hands.
But it is on YouTube. Don't worry. You're on YouTube as well.
Oh, good. Oh, geez. Oh, I did not know that.
I know.
So we do have research months. We don't have research months, so to speak, but during our third year, we're essentially treated like junior faculty. We have our rotation commitments, we have our clinic commitments, and then we're expected to use our free time. So I have 2 half days of clinic per week, and I have 10 weeks of service, and the rest of eight weeks of service, actually. And the rest of the time, I'm expected to be academically productive, whether that's studying, research. And I actually preferred that, having that freedom of my time, and kind of I feel prepared to be an attending and have that time management skills, where I know other programs completely clear your schedule for months at a time so you can just focus on research. And for people who may get distracted with clinic prep and note writing and following up on their inbox, maybe that's better for them. But these are things that I think people should know when they're applying for fellowship that I didn't even know were questions to ask when I was applying. But now that I've gone through fellowship and I've seen my colleagues go through fellowship, I think that these are two really important questions that would have helped me delineate fellowship that was a good fit for me.
Marc, same question to you. Anything you want to share that I may have completely overlooked?
Sure. Also, two things, one of which is related to what Megan was saying. One of the things I wasn't aware of that I'm responsible for as program director is wellness, both for the fellows and the faculty. We have a wellness program. We have dinners with the faculty. We do things, like painting nights and things like that. And so that's something I would ask on an interview trail, especially if you're running out of questions to ask, is, what do you do to promote wellness among the fellows in your program? The other thing I wanted to mention was, sometimes it happens that you don't match on your first try. And I would encourage those applicants to do some soul searching, figure out what maybe didn't work the first round. Maybe they didn't apply broadly enough. Maybe they needed a little bit more research or something else in their application, and apply. We've had fellows who, took a year as a hospitalist and did some research during that year, got to know our faculty, and did match eventually, and they turned out to be fantastic fellows. So, don't give up if you don't match the first try, but try to figure out what you can improve for the next round.
My next podcast is going to be about the interview process as you apply for your first job, by the way, Megan. So I may have to bring you back for this with another colleague in terms of what happens, because I think it's just natural to see really finding a job that's completely a different beast, right? We all went through it, and it's just different. And I really think it helps. This was so enjoyable to me as a host, to be honest. It just brought me back to years back. And Megan, as you know, since you like reading, you see behind me right here, Toxic Exposure. This is a book that you should really read. I just strongly advise that it's a book that you should read. It's written by some guy who has a podcast. There you go. See, he read the book. No, it's really a pleasure to have you, Dr. Marc Braunstein and Megan Melody. Thank you so much for coming on Healthcare Unfiltered.